Alrighty, let's get stuck into this. So I just want to start off, I guess, by sharing very briefly a little bit about how I got into working in the field of birth trauma support. So I used to be a midwife a long time ago before my daughter was born. She's turning 24 this year, and I was raising her as a solo mum. So that really put a spanner in the works of my my midwifery work that I used to do. But about a decade ago, my sister was working in a new mother's sort of support role. She was running these weekly groups for mums in the first year of raising their babies. And she was coming across countless stories of traumatic birth within these groups. And she contacted me and said, Carla, I don't know what to say to these women, and I don't know where to send them for more support, like help. And I was like, far out. I know I used to be a midwife, but I don't know much about birth trauma at all, really. And so I don't really know what to suggest. But if any of them want to come and share their story with me, I'm happy to listen. And I don't know if I'll have any advice to offer or words of wisdom, but I'm happy to listen. And so a few of these women did come and share their story with me, and actually that was a really, really important part of, it was a very important first step on their healing journey. It was really impactful for them to be able to share their story with somebody who was able to hold a safe space for them to do that. I'll talk more about this a little later. But for so many people, when they try to share their experience of their traumatic birth with somebody else, they're met with invalidating sort of comments, and unintentionally invalidating, right? Nobody's aiming to make the woman feel worse. That's the opposite of what they're trying to do. But comments like, oh, just focus on your healthy baby, or at least you got the support you needed to come out the other side of it safe and well, or these sorts of comments like it could have been worse, focus on the positives. And that certainly wasn't my approach. I listened, and usually it was just me listening, but at the end of it there would usually be words like, I'm really sorry you went through that sounded really hard. And wow, I was shocked at what I was getting fed back to me from these women, about how much lighter they felt for just having shared their story with somebody and feel heard and seen for the first time, when revisiting their traumatic birth. So anyway, I was like, wow, that's easy support to offer. Why isn't there more of this available? And I really wanted to understand what support systems were available and what was working and what wasn't, and what people were wanting in terms of support that wasn't available to them, what their experiences of birth trauma were like, what was causing their trauma, what the impacts of their traumatic birth were. Lots of questions, and because I couldn't sort of find this information, there wasn't a lot of research or information out there about birth trauma, and especially birth trauma relating to New Zealand experiences. Back a decade ago, I took it upon myself to conduct my own survey, and I didn't expect to get many responses, because I was sort of asking a lot of respondents in terms of, asking them to share some pretty personal stuff. And I had 319 responses to that survey, which was incredibly telling in and of itself. So that was really helpful for me in terms of understanding what was going on in terms of birth trauma in New Zealand, and the support systems that were helping the ones that weren't, and what women were saying they wanted that wasn't available to them. And also understanding things like why they weren't perhaps accessing the support services like maternal mental health services that were sometimes available to them. A lot of women weren't even aware that such support existed. And also, yeah. Anyway, I don't want to go on about this for too much longer because I really want to kind of get into the guts of today's talk. But if you want to read up about what I found out through that survey I conducted, that document that you can see on the screen there is my report on the findings. It's a really lengthy document, but pages 15 to 18 are specifically around the support services and what worked and what didn't, and why people were accessing what, etc. That document is available on my website. It's also in Cohere where I'm running this from, and if you click on the community tab on the right hand side, there's some resources I've posted there, so some links, and this is one of the links I've posted there, so a couple of avenues for you to access this document if you wish to do so. So yeah, after I'd conducted the survey and I had a clearer understanding of what women were saying they needed and wanted in terms of birth trauma support, I felt like actually I can fill some of that gap. And so I started my business up then, which is now called Healing Birth, but back then it was called Voice for Parents, hence the name on the document there. But yeah, so that's the beginnings of me doing this work. So I've been doing, it's mostly been this sort of one-on-one birth trauma support with people either in person or online via Zoom. Yeah, I've worked with hundreds of women now in that sort of way. But also I run training days for people who work in perinatal care around what birth trauma is, how we can support people who experience birth trauma, how we can mitigate it from happening. And more recently, over the last 3 years, I've been running what I call Healing Birth Practitioner training courses, which are teaching other people who have an interest in birth trauma support work to do what I do. I will talk more about that at the end of this talk. All right, so one of the things I want to first talk about with regards to the healing journey that people go on after they've experienced birth trauma is that usually there's an initial period of suppressing their response, their feelings about their response to their feelings about their traumatic birth. And yeah, most people who see me, they are months, if not years, down the track, you know, in terms of distance from when they actually experienced their birth. Occasionally, I've had, you know, a handful of women who have come to me within the first couple of months, and I've worked with, I think, 2 women who have contacted me within the first month. So it's really rare, and there's a number of reasons for that. And I think for most, there's actually an inability to be able to begin to process what's gone on for them, to feel into their own feelings around it all, and create any sort of time, space, capacity, energy for working through what their birth experience was for them. So there's this inability to be able to begin to process their trauma due to all the overwhelm of new parenthood. You know, they're dealing with sleepless nights, they're dealing with learning to parent a newborn. They're dealing with trying to establish breastfeeding, with perhaps healing from, a cesarean. There's all this that's going on, and there's just no capacity to be able to deal with anything more on top of that. And for others, there's suppression because they don't even realize that what they went through is feasibly called trauma, and they don't really understand why they are feeling so anxious and overwhelmed and detached from their baby, and all these things are going on, and they're not going, oh, that's because I experienced trauma during my birth, because there's this real sort of normalization, I guess, of traumatic birth experiences. For most people, having a cesarean, especially if it's an emergency situation, that's going to be a traumatic event. Yet, close to a third of births are cesareans in New Zealand these days. And so because it's such a common procedure, I think a lot of the people who are performing the cesareans and the staff within the maternity system aren't really appreciating what a big deal this is for a lot of new mums, that this is major surgery, and this wasn't what I had anticipated at all for myself and my baby, and that was really scary and often traumatizing. And so there's this lack of recognition, I think, for what is feasibly called trauma. And, a lot of people are left with this belief that they ought to be thankful, that, things could have been worse, that it was just as well that I was in the hospital, that there were the professionals there to, rescue my baby from me, and this is just how birth is. That's sort of a narrative, and that's not helpful in terms of them, feeling able to voice what their experience was of their birth, because they worry that, I don't want to sound ungrateful, I don't want to sound unappreciative, and everybody's telling me, how lucky I am, or how grateful I ought to be. They're often met with those sort of invalidating responses when attempting to share their trauma, like I talked about earlier. So usually there's this initial period of suppression. And sometimes this used to be more the case when I first started this work. It's not so much now, which is encouraging. I think it is that I used to, most of my clients were women who were either at the stage of contemplating getting pregnant again, or had found themselves pregnant again, and all of this anxiety, panic, overwhelm, fear around giving birth again was coming up because of unaddressed trauma from their first birth experience, and that was when they realized I need to get some help here. Whereas these days I'm getting people earlier after their traumatic births coming and seeing me, which I'm hopeful is a sign that people are understanding that birth trauma is a thing, and that, if you experienced birth as traumatic, then you deserve some support to find healing. So as I kind of talked about a little earlier, the sharing their story, their birth story from their perspective, what their experience was for them, with somebody who can really hold space for them to do that, and for them to feel really seen and heard in their experience, is often such an important first step. Perhaps the most important piece on their healing journey is to be able to share their story in this sort of way. So trauma is usually caused by a sense of overwhelm and powerlessness, and in the birth spaces is often because women are not feeling seen or heard in their experience. um, if you read through that report on the findings from that survey I did, you'll see quotes in there from women who are saying, I wasn't being listened to. If they'd just listened to me when I said such and such, or if they believed me when da 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 da, or there was all this focus on the machines and nobody was focused on me, or everybody was so focused on my baby being um, well or fine or whatever after the birth. Nobody asked me how that experience was for me. So not feeling seen or heard in their experience is often what is at the heart of their of the powerlessness that led to their birth feeling traumatic. And so when they are enabled to share their story and feel really heard in that moment, that is oftentimes the first time that they've had that experience of feeling really witnessed for what their birth was for them. But that requires that they have somebody who knows how to hold a really safe space for them to do that. And that can be tricky, it can be really hard to find somebody who knows how to do this well. Instead, a lot of the time when people share their stories, they are met with, like I said earlier, just focus on the positives, at least you've got a healthy baby, this sort of thing. Or people wanting to talk about their own experience. So, it was awful. I was in labour for 2 days before they such and such, and then they're telling this to someone, and that someone comes back with, oh man, I was in labour for 3 days, and and there's this kind of comparison, or just an inability, I think, for a lot of people to really understand the importance of just listening when somebody's sharing something really vulnerable with them, like their birth story. Part of what I do when I do my healing birth practitioner training is we spend quite a chunk of that training on learning the art of holding safe space. And that means becoming super aware of what our biases are and ensuring we're not putting our own stuff onto the clients we're working with, the women who are sharing their stories with us. And if there are things that could potentially be triggering for us to hear when people are sharing their stories of birth trauma, that we've kind of addressed those triggers, that we are in a place where we are able to hold whatever story somebody brings to us, without feeling too activated, overwhelmed, upset, triggered. If you're on this call, or you're listening to this call, and you're somebody who's experienced birth trauma yourself, and you're on here to find out how you can access your own healing, then if you've got nobody in your world who you feel confident can hold safe space for you to share your story, then get in touch with me. Like working with somebody who knows how to do this well, with one of my people who I've trained. That's I can back them, and I can give you confidence that you're going to be well received when you share your story. When I run what I call an unraveling your trauma session with a client, them sharing their story is the first piece, and sometimes that will take them 20 minutes to share their story, and sometimes it will take 2 hours. So these sessions are quite long. but that's important because we don't want to put time limits on these sorts of things. But then the next step after they've shared their story is that we together unpack their birth story. And I want to spend a bit of time explaining what I mean by this to you, because, and this piece, I think, is what makes healing birth practitioner work stand out from other sort of mainstream support services, is this bit, is helping people to understand their trauma through a different lens than the one they've usually been left with understanding their birth trauma through. So yeah, what do I mean? Where do I start to unpack this? So having somebody, sharing your story with somebody who understands birthing physiology, who understands the impacts of various common birth interventions on that physiology, who understands how the trauma brain works and what it does, you know, to our bodies, to our minds, understanding power dynamics within the birth space, understanding how the birthing system functions, understanding how our conditioning can often add to our sense of trauma in the birth space, and understanding various social and cultural influences on birth, and how that can lead to trauma, are really helpful when it comes to, yeah, unpacking somebody's birth story with them. And so again, this is something that I do in my training. Is I think it's really important that people who are working to help somebody heal after a traumatic birth, they have a good understanding of all these things. So I'm going to run through some examples here, and you can see on the screen I've got little examples. That's more for me than for you, to remind myself of the examples I was going to use to help you to understand what I'm getting at. So why is it important that somebody understands birthing physiology? Well, say you had a traumatic birth, that part of your story was that you failed to progress in labour, right? And those literal words are written in your birth records, you know, cesarean section for failure to progress, syntocin infusion for failure to progress. So you might have this story that your body stopped opening up, you know, you got to 5 centimeters dilated and then got stuck at 5 centimeters for hours, and or you know, maybe even your cervix closed up a bit. Like I was 7 centimeters at 9 a.m. and then at 12 p.m. They did another vaginal exam and I was only, you know, 5 centimeters. Or that your contractions slowed down, or maybe they even stopped, or they got weaker, and so they put an IV infusion of syntocin up. If you have that explained to you by somebody who understands the physiology, you'll learn that this wasn't about your body failing you, which I think most people who leave the birth space having had a traumatic birth have some sort of narrative that runs along the lines of, my baby had to be rescued from my faulty body, something along those lines. So there's this belief that you failed at birth somehow. So failure to progress, I mean, even uses the word failure in it, right? So if we understand the physiology and we can explain to somebody what's really happening when the contractions slow down, when the cervix stops dilating, and help them to appreciate that this is actually your body trying to protect your baby from being born into an unsafe environment, then that's quite a different narrative to understand what's going on. Like, oh, my body was working for me, for my baby, not against me, not against my baby. Because when we feel safe, our body will birth our babies, without the need for any outside interference the vast majority of the time. If we are healthy women, we are well designed to give birth. For the for 90% of us. I don't know. I've thrown that figure into thin air, but because it's hard to know exactly how many women would safely birth their babies without these interventions, because we become so intent on intervening. But for the vast majority of us, we shouldn't need any sort of interference in order to safely birth our babies. And yet, if we look at statistics, the rates of interventions are super, super high. So if we felt safe, if we trusted our bodies to be able to do their thing, if we felt really supported, if we were in a space where we felt, protected, supported, and trusted, then our bodies would work really well to birth our babies. But when we feel unsafe, when we are expressing something and we're not feeling heard, when we are having vaginal examinations done on us that are painful and uncomfortable, and there are strangers coming into the space, or we can hear labouring women down the hall and they sound really frightened, or there's strange smells, or all these things add to our sense of lack of safety. And when we feel unsafe, our body doesn't want to release our babies into that unsafe environment, right? And so it puts us into more of a state of fight or flight to be able to fight off the danger in our space or to run away from it. And to do that, it shuts off our oxytocin, that hormone that causes the contractions. So our body will stop labouring in order for us to try and escape from the danger. This is something that's a primal instinct within us. This is something that we've evolved to develop to. It's a survival technique. So when we fail to progress, it's not that our bodies are failing. They are doing what they're designed to do, and that's to protect us. And so rather than forcing the labour with syntocinon, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had more practitioners within the maternity system that understood this, and therefore instead were like, how can I support you to feel more safe? What are you needing at the moment? Like, let's unpack that. And lo and behold, when people feel supported in that way, usually their oxytocin will get cranking again and they'll come to birth their babies. All right, understanding the system. So and an example of how the birthing system contributes to a lot of needless trauma around birth is that we apply blanket rules to labouring women to birth, right? So and these are often around sort of time frames. So there's policies and protocols within the system that want that if women step outside a certain narrow constraints of what's deemed to be normal, then usually they will be encouraged to have interventions to push them, keep them within these limits. And probably the least evidence-based and the most unhelpful of these is time limits put on various stages of labour. Time in and of itself isn't an issue when it comes to birth, and but it is an issue for the system that only has so many beds and so many staff and etc. So you kind of got to, you know, fit with the conveyor belt system of the birthing system, and therefore, yeah, you you sort of push to have a lot of interventions that you don't really you don't need to have it. The interventions are not to keep you or your baby safe, but rather to allow the birthing machine to function efficiently. Um, so we need much more individualized care. We need much more, looking at the big picture for this woman who's in front of us, nuanced um, interventions to be taking place rather than these applying blanket rules and blanket interventions. Um, if we understand how the brain and body respond to trauma, that can really, and share this with women who, when it comes to unpacking their particular story, that can be really helpful for them. So an example of this is I will often hear women saying things when they're sharing their birth story with me, things that like, I wasn't strong enough. I couldn't handle the pain and I had to have an epidural and I really didn't want to have one. I wasn't strong enough. I should have advocated for myself more. I don't know why I didn't ask them more questions before I agreed to that intervention, to that epidural or to that syntocin and drip. I don't know why I didn't say no. I should have just said no. And yeah, so when I hear these things, I wasn't something enough, or I should have done X, Y, or Z. This really speaks to a lot of the women who I work with are left with feelings of guilt and shame and self-doubt and a sense of that they failed. And so being able to explain to them, well, when you were going through that experience and you were in a state of trauma, when you're in that sort of fight or flight sympathetic nervous system state, your brain is focusing on keeping you alive. It's, and it's part of that is shutting down your prefrontal cortex of your brain, the thinking part of your brain, the part that's responsible for rational thought, the part that's responsible for formulating questions, for language, for speaking. And so when we are in a state of trauma, we often literally don't have the ability to say no, to ask questions, to understand the information that we are being given, and to formulate a coherent response to it. So when people understand that, when they say I should have advocated for myself more, and you say, actually, that wasn't even a possibility, you weren't able to do that, it can take away some of that, like that self-doubt, that guilt, that shame. Understanding power dynamics in the birth space and explaining that to women. So people who enter, that fight or flight, well, we can't really fight or flee in birth. So mostly women enter into a more advanced state of trauma in birth that is some sort of form of freeze. And or fawning. And fawning is so it's part of the autonomic nervous system response. Autonomic meaning kind of automatic. It's happening without any conscious awareness. This is just our body our brains doing what it needs to do to try and increase our chances of survival. So fawning is when we act really appeasing, perhaps kind, smiling towards sometimes the very person who is causing us to feel traumatized. So say we have been treated in a way that's been abusive by the doctor, and then we find ourselves agreeing with them or being nice to them or smiling, we can feel really ashamed about that afterwards. Why was I being nice to that doctor when he was treating me like that? And so having this explained to them, right? Where there's these power dynamics at play, when you believe that that doctor has the ability to keep your baby alive and keep you alive or not, then your brain is going to put you into this like fawning behavior to try and increase the chances that they will keep looking after you, that they will help you to get your baby born safely. Like I said, this is all happening at a very an unconscious level, a subconscious level. But that's just one example of the power dynamics. I mean, power dynamics are huge in the birth space in terms of feeling able or not to be able to voice your needs, what's going on for you. And that's partly due to the conditioning that we have growing up, right? And so I talk a lot about conditioning with people I work with, and people I train as well. We are conditioned within our current sort of Western culture to grow up believing that authority figures like doctors, midwives, know better than we do what's best for us and our bodies and our births. And we are taught not to question authority figures in our lives, that's being rude, that's, be a good girl, be compliant, don't rock the boat, don't be loud, don't argue. I think most of us grow up with being taught to be people pleasers, and that's the last thing we need when it comes to having the birth experience that we're seeking. We shouldn't be feeling the need to please anybody. But if we haven't kind of unpacked this conditioning, if we're not aware that this is what's going on, then it's no wonder that a lot of us will be going with what we're told is best for us, just agreeing even when it doesn't feel true for us. That sort of thing. And social and cultural influences, I've given the example of birthplace there. So, there'd be plenty of people who might like the idea of home birth, say, for their first baby, but no, well, that's dangerous, and why would you risk that? Oh, you're brave. There's all these sort of social and cultural influences that mean that a woman might feel she's being irresponsible if she opts to give birth in the hospital, or she might not if she opts to give birth at home instead of in the hospital, or she might. I mean, most of us grow up with this social and cultural influence that says, and that conditioning that says that birth is inherently a dangerous act, that in order to keep ourselves safe, we need to birth in the hospital and have those medical assistance available and at hand, etc. So when we kind of unpack their birth and explain some of these things to them, it can really help them to yeah, view their birth through a different lens, and one which often removes a lot of that guilt and shame and self-doubt and sense of failure that they have been left with. Of course, there is sometimes the scenario where they are aware of these things, or they have had brilliant support. They do have a good understanding of how birthing physiology works and how to support that process. And, there's been awesome information, awesome support throughout, and yet they've still had a traumatic birth. And I call those scenarios shitty bad luck scenarios. This would be something like, somebody goes into premature labor for no known reason, or has a placental abruption, or has a stillbirth. These are examples where there's no known reason, there's no cause. It's not because they've had bad care. It's not because they haven't been supported in the ways they need to. It's nothing that could have been done to stop these things from happening. I call those shitty bad luck, but those are a small fraction of the women who I work with. Yeah, in saying that, a lot of people are led to believe that their story is one of shitty bad luck. I had this massive postpartum hemorrhage. I was so unfortunate, but they don't realise that it was probably the interventions that they had that led to them having that postpartum hemorrhage. Another example might be, it was just, shitty bad luck that my baby got distressed in labour and I had to have an emergency cesarean for fetal distress. They're not told that it was probably that syntocinon infusion that they had, for failure to progress, that caused their baby to become distressed, because they're not told often about the risks associated with these interventions. So a lot of people think that what they experienced was bad luck, and therefore it was just as well I was in the hospital, or just as well that they were able to save my baby from me, when in actual fact, a lot of the time, it's the interventions that cause the issues and cause the birth to become traumatic. Yeah, I talk quite a lot about this in the last masterclass that I ran, which was on what's causing so much birth trauma. And you can access that from, I've got a YouTube channel now at Healing Birth, if you want to find my YouTube channel, and I've posted it on there. So if you want to watch that at some stage, that will go into much more detail about what I'm getting at there. So mainstream support services, if you go through maternal mental health services, or you go to a counsellor or a psychologist to get some support to heal from your traumatic birth experience, I don't think any of them would incorporate this into the sort of care that they offer you. I think this is quite unique in the way that I work, and those who I train as healing birth practitioners work in terms of helping people to heal from their traumatic birth experience. So very often, I'm just checking the time, 10:50. Oh my goodness, what the this always happens to me. I talk too much. Got too much to say. So if you do need to leave at 11, please don't forget to put your email or a phone number into the chat for me, and so you can be in the draw to win a book. And I apologize in advance. All right, bonding and breastfeeding are very often impacted when people experience birth trauma. So very often women who talk through their traumatic birth with me share that they struggle to bond with their baby, and they often had a lot of trouble establishing breastfeeding and getting their milk coming in. And of course, no new mother expects that they are going to meet their baby for the first time and feel numb or feel like it's not their baby or feel like they just want the baby to be taken away, which is how a lot of the women who I work with experience those first moments with their baby. They often say to me, you know, the baby was put on my chest and I just felt nothing. I felt numb. It didn't feel like my baby. People talk about feelings of resentment towards their new baby, and there's just so much shame and grief and guilt associated with these feelings, because of course they'd always just envisaged that they would, that those first moments with their baby would be this most amazing loved up affair, like it is for a lot of women, and that's how birth designs it for us, for it to be. That our physiology is supported, we have a massive kind of dose of oxytocin, love drug hormone, flooding our brains and our bodies at the moment that we meet our baby, and so that we are primed to feel really connected with and bonded to them from the get-go, so that we will nurture them and look after them. It's, you know, it's part of how we've evolved as mammals. And for people who have in a state of trauma at the time of birth, and or if they have had synthetic oxytocin, so syntocinon inductions, or had their labour forced, like sped up, augmented with syntocinon, they will not have that flood of endogenous or naturally produced oxytocin to their brains. So the syntocinon that they get given intravenously, it's the same chemical sort of composition as the stuff that they've released in their brains, but it can't cross the blood-brain barrier to reach their brains. And so although syntocinon will force the uterus to contract and get the baby born in that sort of way, it won't have the helpful effects on the brain that our naturally produced oxytocin will. So it won't cause us to feel those feelings of love and protection and connection, and lots of other helpful things that oxytocin does, but that's a conversation for another time. But yeah, so explaining this to new mums, helping them to understand that this is a normal response. It is normal to feel numb, to feel nothing towards your baby at the moment of birth when your birth has been traumatic, and that there are so many other mothers who have this exact same experience. So this doesn't make you a bad mother. It doesn't make you mean you are lacking some sort of mothering gene. And it's also not a life sentence. There are things we can talk about to help you to fill that hormonal gap, and to, establish a deeper, stronger bond with your baby. Can be such a validating thing for women to learn, and because they can feel so incredibly isolated. They don't want to admit this horrible thing, that I don't love my baby, that I don't feel connected to my baby. I mean, because what sort of a mother am I? not realizing that, like I just said, this is a really common response. There's a lot of women who experience birth trauma, and there's a lot of women who have a lack of bond with their baby initially. And also the physiology associated with trauma and various aspects of the birth experience that will interfere with the ability to produce milk and to get breastfeeding established. I find that a lot of babies of mums who have experienced birth as traumatic are particularly fractious babies as well. I mean, they've had their own experience of trauma through that birth, and that, I think, probably impacts the breastfeeding experience as well. But yeah, there's lots more I could talk about for this, but time. Yeah, but yes. So the third part of what I do when I do an unraveling your trauma session with somebody, with a client, so they share their story, we unpack their birth story, and then I offer a bunch of tools. And so some of the tools are around healing their bond with their baby. All right, prioritizing self is just so important. I mean, we're in this culture that sort of says that the selfless mother is the epitome of good mothering, which is just such a horrible thing. A selfless mother, a mother who doesn't have a self, who puts everybody else's needs ahead of her own, is somehow something to look up to and aspire to. And that is incredibly detrimental especially for a mum who has entered motherhood in a really kind of traumatic way. And especially in a culture that does not know how to support new families. We are atrocious. We really chuck our new parents in the deep end in every sense of the word when it comes when it comes to starting life as a family. And so I talk a lot about the importance of you time. So where possible, because sometimes it's just not possible, because there isn't anybody who can help with the baby in order for the mum to have some time to herself. But depending on how old her baby is and what sort of support she has around her and what her relationship is like with her partner, etc., if possible, I say there needs to be a regular time every week that you can count on where the dad is going to look after the baby and if baby's little, it might only be for half an hour for the first whatever months, and then that extends to 3 hours when the child is a toddler or whatever. But regular time every week where you prioritize yourself and your needs and get to refill your cup. I say you have given so much of yourself to grow and birth and breastfeed, nurture, look after your little baby, and you need to give back to yourself because you can't continue to pour from an empty cup. And part of this you time, I suggest, is spent allowing yourself to feel and process all of your emotions. I talked about suppression at the start of this talk, and emotions are meant to be felt. Suppressing them, they don't go anywhere. They eke out in unhelpful and sometimes damaging ways. And so we need to acknowledge the importance of feeling our emotions and enabling time and space for us to process them, to feel them, to let them move through us. And a lot of the tools that I suggest are tools to enable that to happen. Yeah. Birth trauma is a form of loss. I talk about birth trauma as a form of loss, and therefore there will be a grieving process to go through from that. And I talk about it as a form of loss because I think when we are pregnant with our babies, we all have this image of what we hope our birth to be and our start to life as, you know, a mother of our newborn to be. And a lot of us work really hard in our pregnancies to set ourselves up for that. And think we've done all the right things, you know, and then it goes nothing like what we'd hoped. And we can't get that experience back again. And it's this really, really important, treasured time in our lives, right, that we're going to remember for the rest of our days. It's really impactful. And when it is traumatic, yeah, there is going to be a sense of loss. It is a form of loss, and there is going to be a grief that needs to follow that. Like any loss, there's going to be grief. And yet a lot of people who I work with, and they could be 1 or 2 years after their traumatic birth, and I say to them, have you ever let yourself just have a good cry around your birth? And they'll be like, no, not really. You know, I used to cry a lot in the early days from just overwhelm, etc. But no, I haven't. I've never, yeah. And I think part of that is that narrative that says that they just need to focus on the positives and look at the bright side, and things could have been worse, and I just need to be grateful. I'm going to whip through these last slides. I'm not going to talk too much to them because we're just about there. But writing is, a lot of the tools that I suggest are writing based. That's accessible to a lot of people, and writing is a really therapeutic, cathartic tool for a lot of us. Yeah. If you can't share your birth story with somebody who you can trust to hold that space for you to do so, sometimes writing your birth story can be really powerful as well. When we write things down, we can often, and then read over it, we can often sort of see things in a different light. I sort of talk about it like when I'm doing a painting and I'm really getting stuck into it and I'm up close to it, it will look a certain way, and you know, I'll be working away for a couple of hours, and then I'll go away and have some lunch or something and come back, and it will look different. I'll see things that I didn't notice when I was sort of stuck up close to it and really involved in it. And I use this as an analogy to sort of describe how it is a lot of the time for people when they write, is that when their story is just in their head, it will look a certain way. And sometimes when we write it out and we read over what we've written, it's like, oh, no wonder I felt, you know, so abandoned or triggered or whatever. And it's like, it's such a jumbled mess up here. Our minds are not very helpful or a good friend to us often. Sometimes when we write things out, we can find a bit more self-compassion. And it's also helps with ordering our thinking. It also helps with feeling like we are just one step removed from those ruminations. So we're putting them down out here. And instead of it just all staying up in our heads. So yeah, writing your birth story can be really helpful. And I would encourage anybody who's writing their birth story as a kind of a therapeutic tool to not hold back, to write it, to handwrite it rather than typing it out, and to not write it like anybody is going to read it. So you let it be your story fully. It's not a story that you're writing for your child to read one day, or for your spouse to read or whatever. It's just for you to process what's going on for you. And you might even want to ceremoniously burn the letter afterwards, as a form of release. Not the letter, the birth story, or not, but yeah, just if you're going to write your birth story, do it in an unrestrained way. Let it just be whatever whatever is going on up here, put it down out there. Yeah, and writing letters to yourself, to the baby, to your partner. These are all tools that I suggest, and I kind of give like, not instructions is the wrong word because that just sounds too prescribed, but I give suggestions around what sorts of things you might write in these letters. Journaling is really, really powerful. And I remember once running a group, like a birth trauma support group. It was an online group, and asking if anybody had had any tools already suggested to them around healing from their birth trauma. And one of them said, I was told to keep a gratitude journal, and so like every night before bed I write down 3 or 5 things that I'm grateful for from my day. And I was like, awesome, acknowledging what we're grateful for and reminding ourselves of those things is really important. I said, but we also need to create space and opportunity to feel into the other feelings as well, right? And so if somebody's wanting to keep a gratitude journal, I would suggest to them as well, like, write down 3 things that you've found hard from your day, or that have been frustrations, or that you're disappointed about, and 3 things that you're grateful for, so that there's room for all of your emotions, and you're not just again kind of feeling like you're suppressing the difficult emotions and forcing yourself to just focus on the things you're grateful for. Post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress symptoms are really common in, women who have experienced birth trauma. So these are symptoms like having nightmares or flashbacks related to their traumatic births, experiencing like avoidance, so wanting to avoid places or people, conversations, anything that they associate with the birth. So it might be like, I don't drive that way into town anymore, I go the longer way because then I don't have to go past the hospital where the traumatic birth happened. They can be hyper reactive to stimuli, so that's where their sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, is getting triggered by sounds, sights, smells, that sort of thing. And so particularly jumpy, particularly anxious. Pretty much everybody who I work with has some degree of anxiety since their traumatic births. Hypervigilance, where they're kind of thinking the worst case scenario is going to happen all the time, especially with regards to their baby. So again, feeling on edge all the time. Yeah, depressed mood. These are common PTSD symptoms. And talk therapy, talking through your experience with somebody isn't going to, for most people, is not going to take care of PTSD. And I always, if people who I work with have quite a number of these sort of symptoms going on, or are still kind of being really impacted by these symptoms, I will often suggest to them that they have some sort of a psychosensory therapy like EMDR, and more recently havening. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprogramming. It's so I think psychologists typically are, the ones who are trained in this. I think there's quite a lot of training involved. But it was, when I did my survey, it was one of the things that came through as being most helpful for people to manage PTSD, to remove some of these like triggers, I guess. So and havening, which is it seemed too simple to be true and effective, but I keep hearing good things about it. So I actually just trained in havening myself a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, oh my gosh, it does work. But it's using a touch whilst kind of working through PTSD symptoms, and both of these techniques are about sort of essentially like rewiring the brain so that you're not going to be triggered in the same ways when you come across those stimuli that cause you to have that fight or flight response, etc. And then there's a bunch of other tools. This is my last slide, I'm pretty sure. So I offer tools around processing anger, and I suggest somatic tools like dance and breathwork or mindfulness or using art. There's community support. So there's a Facebook group I started back when 10 years ago. I don't admin it anymore, but it's a closed Facebook group called Birth Trauma Support NZ, which is a space for support around birth trauma specifically. But if you can find local support networks, that's a great way to. Another good resource, actually, and I haven't written it there, is the website mybirthstory.org.nz. Kate Hicks, who founded Birth Trauma Aotearoa Trust, she created that website, and so that's a really good resource for finding what support services are available in your community and that sort of thing. New Zealand based, obviously. Listening to stories of hope and inspiration. So I started my podcast, Healing Birth with Carla, about 18 months ago, and so I interview people who have experienced a traumatic birth and gone on to find healing, and usually gone on to have a really healing birth experience. And so listening to others' stories of people who have been in the place that you've been in and who have accessed healing, found healing, and had a really healing birth experience can give you a lot of hope. It can provide you with some information, some tools, ideas around how others have healed, and can be inspiring in terms of, and hopeful in terms of, what a next birth for yourself could look like. I also have occasionally interviewed people on the podcast who work in a way that supports healing after birth trauma too. So it's not just stories from women. And I started a YouTube channel recently at Healing Birth, where I'm offering bits of like information, speaking to different topics and things like that myself. So it's just me talking birthy stuff, birth trauma stuff. So these are free tools and resources if you want more information, either as somebody who's experienced birth trauma and want to heal, or somebody who is working with people who you come across who may have experienced birth trauma. On Instagram, I'm at healing.birth, and if you want to read back through my old Instagram posts, you'll learn a lot as well. And same goes for my Facebook page at Healing Birth with Carla. And I could do a whole big spiel about post-traumatic growth as well, but what I find is that a lot of people who experience birth trauma and then have support to find healing want to then go on to help others to access healing. And quite a few people who have gone on to do, who have done my healing birth practitioner training, that's how it started for them. So they had a traumatic birth. They might have worked with me, or one of them worked with one of my healing birth practitioner trainees, because at the end of your training you have like a practice client session. If you follow me on social media, you would have seen me post about this. Every time I near the end of one of my trainings, I'm looking for people who want to be set up with one of my soon-to-be graduates for for them to have a go at running one of these unraveling your trauma sessions. Yeah, so I've given the sun in my eye here. Beautiful day in Tauranga. So that is it. So yeah, this slide is about my healing birth practitioner training program. In case some of you on the call are interested, it's a 10-week program. My next one starts on the 27th of May, so it's not that long away, just a little over 2 weeks. And yeah, I go into lots of depth about all the things I've talked about today over the 10 weeks that we work together. If you are potentially interested in doing that training and you want to know more about it, I have put a link in the community section, or just, yeah, get in touch with me. We can get on a Zoom call together and talk it through if you like. But I tend to run 3 a year. So my next one after this one will be in September or October. I think October it starts. And that is it. And we will, copy of the book will go to one of you who has put your email address or your phone number into the text box.